It's not.
Yeah, to give us all a bit more power to survive this day and all the following days, and to get some energy to move forward. We can use electric power for our laptops, but to get more brain power, we have a great guest today with us, Federico Savini from University of Amsterdam. You already see the title, taking us into thoughts about degrowth, post-growth, and a lot of work he has done over the past, already quite many years now. And we have also done a bit of work together on that, or part of a book project. And we are honored to have you here. I would say the floor is yours. You're invited to ask questions afterwards, of course, but Federico also has several moments in between where you might ask questions or just raise your hands and maybe he reacts to you and then
maybe I ignore.
I'm sure there is a way, but you know there are points in the presentation where you feel like first I want to make this point and then get to some discussion. So if there's no immediate reaction, that it's not against you, but then it's one of these points. And otherwise, we have decent time, maybe to include also a break at some point. We will see. And then to end on time, also for those who stay here with a bit of break for Stefano's lecture afterwards. So Federico, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian. And thank you for inviting me to present here, and thank you to you all for reading my work and getting the time to listen to me. I would like to go back to this picture at the end of the presentation because there is a meaning in it, and I think we should share it. And your colleague already understood that this is Tuscany. It doesn't have to do anything with Italy, but the picture itself has a meaning that I think it's important for me. So when we talk about degrowth or post-growth in science and public debates, nowadays we see some words that come up very often, right? Like often we use other words, or politicians or economists use words like recession, austerity, krimpen, shrinking, consuminderen, consume less. There's generally a misunderstanding about degrowth that these words make clear. Also, I think this word make clear also that there is a deliberate attempt often to ridicule the idea of degrowth because it's not feasible, or it's basically counteracting the mainstream thinking and leading some and breaking some key interest in the economy as it works now. So my presentation will start giving you a general but precise definition of degrowth and what it means. Now, when we talk about degrowth, we are embracing a way of thinking that can be defined more generally as a post-growth. In the Netherlands, these two terms are used interchangeably. There is a book recently by Paul Schenderling that became very famous in Holland called Er is leven na het groei. It's a post-growth book. It doesn't use the word degrowth, but post-growth is basically already a step beyond the mainstream green growth type of thinking. So when we embrace a post-growth thinking, we basically reject three myths of current economic thought. The first is that economic growth is good for society as a whole and for personal well-being. That's the first myth that we reject. The second is that economic growth can be decoupled from environmental degradation. And the third is that economic growth is necessary to achieve climate targets. These are three myths that get rejected as soon as we step into the post-growth thinking. And when we talk about economic growth, just to be precise, we're talking about GDP growth. So the growth of all financial and economic transactions in the economy. GDP is a measure of financial and economic transactions, right? This doesn't measure all the other things we do. It measures economic transactions. And the post-growth thinking says we should start thinking in terms of economic transactions and embrace a different way of thinking and acting. Yes. So based on that definition, how can we define degrowth? There are many definitions out there. One, your colleague just presented one. I made my own definition, and I think this works especially for spatial planning students and colleagues. So degrowth is a socio-political transformation, okay, from First, a planned downscaling of all activities that are environmentally harmful and socially alienating, starting from those that are less necessary for the well-being of humans and the environment. Less necessary is a key word here. I will go back to that. However, degrowth is not only a decrease, but it's also a planned increase or a planned improvement of all activities that regenerate the ecosystem and improve social well-being, starting from the fulfilling of basic needs. Both of this needs to be done in a democratic and an equitable way. I think this definition says very clearly when we talk about degrowth, we're not talking about decreasing only, but we are talking about a project of increasing and improvement of all those activities that regenerate and that improve well-being, starting from meeting basic human needs, especially where those human needs are not met. I'm talking about housing, food, heat, clothing. So it's a project of, in fact, social justice as well. Now, degrowth is set against the idea of green growth. The idea of green growth, I guess you're familiar with, basically says that we can basically increase GDP while at the same time decoupling this increase from environmental degradation. These usually advocates of green growth points at the possibility of absolute recoupling and at the fact of that the economy is already relatively decoupling. You know the definition, the difference between absolute and relative. If you don't, I will just give you a quick explanation. The idea of relative decoupling is what you see here, is that the line of the GDP, the orange line, grows at the fastest pace to the line of the global CO2 emissions. It's relative because both of the lines grow together, but one grows at a less pace to the one of the GDP. Relative decoupling is happening globally. This image shows it. We are emitting less CO2 relative to our pace of GDP growth. Absolute decoupling would mean that the line of CO2 would decrease while the GDP would increase. Not increase more slowly, but decrease. Okay. That's what economists at the moment, most economists and mainstream sustainability strategies are claiming that is still possible. But there is no proof, actually, historically, that that's being done. This image globally shows that this is not happening. Moreover, and this is more important even for planners, if we take the material footprint of the economy, so not the CO2 emission, but all the materials that are used in the economy, and of course all other types of emissions, then we see that there is not even a relative decoupling. We see that GDP growth and material destruction, in fact, and depletion are tightly coupled. That's the orange line and the pink line. Now, this image I showed you, it's very different from the targets that we're setting ourselves. The IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, produces a report every 5 to 6 years. This report summarizes all the climate science available, and it shows what we should do in order to meet important climate targets like 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial level increase, right? Now, if we take that science seriously, we see that we would achieve a large reduction of emissions, and I'm talking only emissions here, in order to meet the 1.5 degrees. Now, this report is already old, 1 year old, and is already very conservative. We know by now that this is impossible to achieve, 1.5 degrees. We're already heading to 2 to 3 degrees. This large reduction of emissions is not happening, as I showed you before. So the degrowth research and action comes into the picture here, by the way, also in the IPCC report, as a concrete alternative strategy to meet these climate targets of reduction. Now, the degrowth thinking is also a social justice program. Why? It's because if we take the picture of CO2 emissions and material footprint, we know that these emissions and material extraction are not equally distributed in society. A recent study by Oxfam shows, in fact, that the richest 10% people in the globe produce actually 50% of all the emissions globally, while the bottom 50% produces only 10% of the emission. This image is actually taking the whole globe in consideration, so the global north, global south division. However, if we go more into details and we see the most recent publications, we see that this inequality in environmental impact, in the responsibility for environmental impact, is also happening within the global south and within the global north. So if you see the picture on the left, and we take Europe, we see that the top 10% incomes emit 5 times more than the bottom 50% in Europe. If we take East Asia, where China is included in this case, there is even worse, the gap. 40 tons of CO2 per year for the top 10% and 2.9 tons for the bottom 50%. This picture shows that when we talk about reduction of excess, we're not talking about reduction of everybody. We're talking about tackling what is actually really leading the major share of environmental destruction. In Europe, would be the top 10% in that case. By the way, the climate targets, the Paris targets set the limits, the ideal limits of CO2 emission per capita to 2 tons per year. If you take that, 50% of East Asia is already meeting that. If you take that, the bottom 50% of Europe is already much closer to that. I think we can get there much easier. The problem lies in the top incomes. If we take an historical picture of the same situation, we see, in fact, that between 1990 and 2019, the middle classes actually degrowed their emissions. They decreased the amount of emissions relative to the others. But the top 1% increased exponentially. So what we see here is that the income inequality of wealth in countries, it's one-to-one related to environmental responsibility. So the richest are those that through their consumption and investments are destroying the planet more than the poor. So degrowth is a social project first. By decreasing excess, we can also meet climate targets. As you remember, the first myth that post-growth thinking is debunking is that economic growth is good for our well-being and socially and individually, right? Now, these studies shows, there are more and more studies recently showing that, in fact, there is no direct correlation between GDP growth and life satisfaction of people. The image on the left shows what we generally call the Easterling paradox, basically named after this economist that made this study, that shows that basically after a certain point, the increase in economic output in GDP doesn't translate in increase in life satisfaction. This is more or less the red line. That means that, for example, countries like the United States or Switzerland that have a huge economic size in terms of GDP score almost at the same level of Colombia, for example, which have a completely different size of the economy. This doesn't surprise. When we ask people what they care about their life, they say most of the time family, friends, social contacts, and less about work and consumption. It might sound obvious, right? But somehow economists tend to forget this. And planners too, sometimes. They plan for the economy rather than for those needs that we really, really like. This image shows the same paradox, but taking the material stock. So having more stuff doesn't lead to more social progress. That's what the social progress index measures. On the left, we see, for example, that economies that have a lot of stuff, but not only stuff we consume like clothes and houses, but also, mining, concrete, metals, food, farming. We see economies that have a lot of it, like Germany and Czech Republic, have the same social progress of New Zealand and Costa Rica, we see that the amount of stuff that is processed by the economy doesn't translate in social progress. And the same goes with the amount of energy. There's no direct relation. At one point, it just flattens. These images also show, by the way, when we talk about degrowth, we talk about basic needs, right? Increasing basic needs. These images show that at one point, countries need to grow to meet social progress. There are countries, extremely poor countries, mostly located in Africa, in East Asia, that need to actually grow their material stock and energy stock per capita, because they need to arrive to a level of social progress that allows them to thrive, right? But so these images, again, point at the excess, not at the places where basic needs are not met. It's basically it's being done already. Maybe you heard about the donut framework of Kate Raworth. You heard that she is traveling, the world with applying this framework to cities, and Amsterdam was the first, right? The donut. What they did was basically this: they calculated what was the social foundation of life, so the inner ring of the donut. They saw where they were underscoring or underperforming. In terms of, in the case of Amsterdam, was about loneliness, was stress and burnouts, family relations were difficult, so people were consuming well, working well, but their life was getting less quality, so they started to think, okay, we need to improve those indicators. And they started to design a policy for those indicators. I mean, I'm very critical of that policy, but that was the approach. Okay. Maybe in this presentation, I will talk about this. Okay. So now this was the general introduction about the economics of degrowth. So now let's go to cities and planning. That's the field where I am more familiar with, and you too, I guess. Actually, your colleague already mentioned this. So when we think about economic growth and material stocks, around the 80s, with the great decentralization and post-industrialization, let's say, in the global north, we see that cities became the key motors of economic growth. So in 1987, this book came out that showed urban fortunes, that showed, in fact, that the economy of countries was fueled by real estate and finance. Real estate was the most important commodity then, and was an urban commodity. That was the time of, the big post-industrial developments, the riverbanks redevelopments, big investors coming from manufacturing and old industries investing in real estate. This was the urban renaissance period. That's where the most money were produced. Later, in 2008, we have a new version of this urban renaissance. It was, portrayed in this case by one of the most influential economists at the time, Edward Glaser, that showed that cities were the test bed of innovation and smart innovations. That's where the wealth was produced again, where apps and infrastructures and smart infrastructure were designed, not produced, designed in cities. Of course, in between those, we had all other phases like the creative class period, in 2000. But the point is that there was a series of economic and planning policies that were deliberately pushing cities to become motors of economic growth. Well, the result of that is that, in fact, cities cover 2% of the global surface, right? But they do consume 75% of all materials of the economy. That's where most of the material density is concentrated. Also, not only, also the wealth is concentrated there. Only 600 cities in the world cover 2/3 of the whole economy of the planet. So when we talk about growth and degrowth, I think we really need to go into the cities and see how they work. That's my argument here. The projections of urbanization are pretty scary too, and that's another reason why we need to do this. We know that by 2050, our economy will demand the double amount of raw materials today. And what we see here is that the gray part is the material input to stock. That means this is not only energy or food, it's actually sand, gravel, stone, stuff that cities are made of. If we look into the details of these studies, and you can find them online, and I have the citation here, we see that, for example, in Africa, in 2050, we will need about 850% more concrete than today, 850% in Africa. In China, 350%. In Europe, 40% more. And this is a low estimation because our building stock comes from the post-war era, and after 50 years, things get old and need to be repaired. So we will probably more than that. So these are particularly scary pictures if you think in terms of material footprint, the image I showed you before. By the way, cities will also produce more waste. This image, again, is an aggregate. In Europe, we're talking about 40% more waste by 2050. We also see that the waste from industry is actually decreasing. Industries are doing very well in reusing their waste and, doing circular economy stuff, blah, blah, blah. But if we look at cities, municipal solid waste, we also see that that's increasing from the 80s on. So cities are producing more waste, industry is producing less. So the waste stream that we have are mostly located within cities. This also brings in the issue of, circular reuse and regenerative reuse of urban waste. So planning, in all this story of urbanization, had a very contradictory role. In fact, when we teach planning to our students, we teach them a bit to be schizophrenic, I have to say. That's why I feel guilty also as a teacher. On the one hand, planners have been promoting urban growth for the economy, in fact, right? They built retail parks, infrastructures for high-speed connections, business districts, of course, the holy grail of planning, the business district, and campuses. We plan cities for economic performance. We've done that, and we are obsessed with that often as planners. However, planners are also very nice people that try to compensate for that, economic acceleration by providing with basic services in cities. We're talking about green, social housing, of course, energy efficiency. So our students, my students, are all into participation, well-being, housing, families, children facilities. There is a lot of that in planning. So I'm not making it a bad picture. However, we see that the social side of planning is increasingly linked to the economic side of it. Somehow, we have never stopped thinking in terms of trickle-down economics. We need a growing city, a wealthy city, in order to pay for the social services, in order to pay for green, in order to pay for bike infrastructures, right? So we assume that the wealthy city is a livable city because it is, in fact, economically performative. This is an assumption that's still used a lot by planners. This basically is a way to compensate somehow for the damages of economic growth, as we saw it, the material damages and also the human damages of it, by compensating, by using compensating measures. Now, within planning, sustainability strategies have also somehow showed these limits clearly. Let me get into this briefly. So, one of the main sustainability strategies today is electrification, right? So the idea that if we electrify and produce energy with renewables, we can decouple, in fact, the CO2 emissions from cities from their economic performance. We have plenty of measures of decreasing CO2 emissions and improving air quality in cities. Amsterdam is very proud to be a city where air quality has improved. Many cities are indeed decreasing CO2 emissions, but the trick of these measures is that they do not consider the fact that the costs of those transitions are being displaced in other places. It's a bit like, we are consuming less stuff, we are producing less CO2, but the production of our stuff is made in China. So globally, it's a compensating mechanism. Globally, we're just cost shifting, the environmental cost of our economic growth.
Is that intentional?
Well, no, there's no intentionality in all of this.
Okay.
I don't believe in conspiracy theories or things like this. I think the complexity lectures of later will show you there's no one intentionality. It's a result of our economic system.
Okay.
But there is awareness. So we know that if a politician says, my target is to reduce CO2 emissions in the city, I don't care what happens, in the other side of the planet. It's an intentional denial.
Okay.
Let's call it that way, or intentional ignorance.
Okay.
Well, the case of electrification is very clear because not only at the end of the pipe, electrification produces waste that is extremely polluting, but also electrification is a process that demands extreme amounts of materials, which have a very large land use impact. Let's take lithium, which is in our batteries. Lithium is driving now the commodity markets. The price is increasing at very fast pace, even for more than that, actually, by 2030. And there are increasing studies that show that if we actually would cover for example, the entire city of solar panels to produce green energy, we would still cover only 2% of the energy demand of our cities.
Seems like a problem.
You see the problem, right? Moreover, we will need a large expansion of lithium mines, which are one of the most extensive, let's say, how do you say, the largest, one of the most land extensive economic activities. Let me give you a concrete data. So on the left, you see the land use per each energy source for each megawatt hour, right? So land use is extremely important for planners. That's why I took this image. Now you see that hydropower has a very high land use because we need to basically cover large sections of the country with water, like with big dikes. Of course, coal has a large use. Why? Because of the mining, right? But we see that also solar panels have a large land use if installed on the ground. And this is actually what's happening in many countries. We don't install solar panels on the roofs yet. We put them on the ground, consuming a lot of land. This land, by the way, is taken mostly from agriculture. We know it in Italy. If you go to Italy, you will see a lot of land covered with solar panels, also in the Netherlands. Now, if it's on the roof, it's a very low land use, okay? Now, the striking one is wind, our big investment nowadays. Wind is the one who has the largest land use demands per each unit of electricity raised. It's 250 square meters minimum, and some countries tend to have even more. Now, when we talk about wind onshore in the Netherlands, this problem becomes very clear. This image, for example, it was made by an anti-wind turbine movement in Amsterdam, showing how influential would be, the safety area of wind turbine if located near cities. That's why we're building wind offshore, right, on the water. The question here is, can we cover urban energy needs with these figures? If urban energy needs are growing without stopping, can we meet that? Is that something we can do, or we will end up covering all our land with wind turbines? So the paradox is, sure, we need renewables, but can we do that in a livable and feasible way if we don't consider the economy to be limited, right? That's the paradox of the green energy from a degrowth perspective. The argument, therefore, is that we do need to degrowth in order to have an effective use of renewable energies. Let's talk about green. So another counter effect of mainstream sustainability policies it's what we can define as eco-gentrification. Now, why is eco-gentrification a problem here? This is exactly the one case of connecting green targets to economic targets. So when we invest in green in prime areas, we invest there because we know that green will increase values of the built environment in those areas. And also the reason why we invest in those areas is because we know that will be the result as planners. So by doing that, this is the risk, is that we are just making sustainability policies selective to areas of high economic potential. The risk is basically to couple, again, sustainability targets with economic targets. It's an approach, that of greening, that I think is going towards an end very soon, because we know that doesn't deliver also so much in terms of reduction of CO2. It doesn't deliver so much in terms of biodiversity, and it doesn't deliver so much in terms of well-being, because some key areas are, in fact, not profiting so much where the needs are the highest. Well, these two images are very famous. Do you know what they are? Yeah. What is the left one?
I think it's the New York raised.
Yeah, the High Line in New York.
Yeah.
And the right is just the greening of two phallic skyscrapers in the center of Milan. The Bosco Verticale is just a man-made form of greening of a building that's very high density and gentrifying a neighborhood in the city of Milan. Well, Stefano knows everything about this. It is probably right. So an urban degrowth, to summarize, is a program that tries to downscale and slow down the metabolism of cities. When I talk about metabolism, basically I talk about all the stuff that comes in and comes out. The idea is basically to downscale those demands, to slow it down so less stuff comes in, and that stuff that comes in and get processed at a slower pace, but also reducing, in fact, also closing up the metabolism by reusing what comes out. This has to be done by reducing excess consumption, as I said, not everything, but just where excess is located, to increase the well-being, basically, of those groups that are not meeting basic standard of life, so redistribute wealth, and at the same time, create a regenerative relation between cities and their hinterland, their environment. So that's a degrowth program. Now, hard to do, but I would say this is easier than sucking CO2 out of the air, or making huge floating panels reflecting sunlight, or maybe even reforesting entire Amazon sections. Maybe it's easier to do this. As soon as we start thinking in terms of buying time through technology, we are actually going back to the wrong solution, because those arguments has been used already for a long time in order, in fact, to dismiss alternative strategies. So I think the problem is exactly that we are just hoping still for a revolutionary technology which use and feasibility is not yet actually proven 100%, while we are forgetting that our target is not just to reduce to meet the temperature increase, but it's actually to improve the well-being of people. That would be the target. So the degrowth story is like, sure, invest in renewables. Sure, do some research maybe on low-tech geotechnologies. Maybe reforestation would be the first, even before rejection of sunlight. But prioritize well-being, prioritize decreasing demand. So the problem of this climate politics is that there is no equal sitting around the table. The geotech is much more powerful than the low-tech and the social tech. When you sit at the table, there is no equal playing field. There is no equal playing field because the money streams are not equal, because the subsidies are not equal. So offering time would be another way, I think, to delay a shift that, in my view, it's needed. But doesn't include renewable energy is completely compatible with the degrowth agenda. Geoengineering is much less. Also, I'm not sure how fast it would be to suck CO2 from the air in large scale quantity if our economy keep doubling in each 20 years. The compound growth. So our economy is growing in a compound way. That means that in 20 years, if an economy grows 2% a year, in 25 years, it will double. Imagine the double amount of materials and the double amount of energy. So we're talking about extreme acceleration. I just started 2 months ago with a new research project, and I have a whole team working on circular degrowth. Mm-hmm. So the fastest, is a long discussion, the fastest answer maybe it's actually in a chapter that is coming out now, where I title The Circular Economy of Cities, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, using the words of the movie. So the circular economy is a good idea, but it can be implemented in different way depending on how we regulate it and which power actors are basically using that term. There is a good way to do it. It's the circular economy basically that is associated with targets of social justice and sufficiency, which is basically one of the key principles of degrowth. It's a circular economy basically that creates employment, brings back the issue of meeting basic needs, but also, in fact, is associated with processes of education, of consuming less. And this is a good circular economy, but there is also the bad and the ugly, which I invite you to find in this chapter. I'm not going to get too long into that, but I invite you to read that, because in my study of the circular economy in Holland, I found out different parallel discourses on circular economy, which coexist at the moment. But as the movie shows, the good, the bad, and the ugly are all basically after the same thing, the goal, which in this case is waste and obsolete materials. And eventually, who takes that will take it out from the others. They're also in competition. That's why I use that metaphor. But it's available online, open access. So when I was thinking about degrowth and I was reading about degrowth, the work of Christian and other people, I was, I wanted to find the answer to this challenge. How do we do this? Of course, that's a big question. So I was looking for answers in what is written out there, right? Well, most of the work on degrowth, it's actually, in fact, talking about cities. There's a lot out there about cities, and most of the writers were pointing out at somehow de facto solutions, some real-life solutions at a small scale. Most of them were pointing at the slow mobility, pedestrianizing zones, slow food, markets, housing cooperatives, grow your own food, urban gardens, repair cafes. There were all these practices, and there are papers out there that review these practices, so you can read into that. My frustration with those works was that they tend to focus at the micro scale of cities, so really the dense urban environment and how people do it. And they hardly explain, in fact, how planning should react to those. They were basically offering prefiguration, like real-life solutions, but rather than principles, or rather than rules and regulations, or rather than governance systems. I think planning has to offer something to offer there. The question is, what are the principles, what are the procedures, governance, and power system that do reflect those practices? So I decided to work on that and try to make my own understanding of this. So the first thing I had to ask myself is like, okay, before understanding how to degrow urban economy, let's look at how they grow, right? What are the processes that produce economic growth and urban GDP? So in a paper, I listed 3 of those, and I will go through them, and maybe we can discuss a bit how we can see them. So the first process that creates economic growth in city is functional specialization or specialization. This is coming already since the 80s. You might have heard about the agglomeration effects, right, of cities. We know that cities are becoming competitive in a global economy by specializing on specific economic sectors. Being that, for example, the Silicon Valley in San Francisco, that's the Bay Area, that was one of the most important cases, or the financial economy in Amsterdam. That's why we build business districts or an entire infrastructures to push for a particular sector that becomes somehow the driver of the urban economy. The sector, of course, becomes a hub. It creates all kinds of other related functions that generate jobs and activities and push the economy, the cities to grow, right? So we see this specialization in many cities. And many urban policymakers are always wondering, so what is our economic identity? So specialization is actually the first mechanism. The risk of this is that cities become much less autonomous in how they function. So autonomy really means they become very dependent on global flows of capital, human capital, financial capital, and also natural and material resources. So if one day the financial economy crashes, all of a sudden we have a bubble that makes our economy collapse. It's extremely unresilient. If one day the cost of gas is increasing very much, all of a sudden our farming economy suffers. If fertilizers cannot be found, then our whole farming industry is suffering. So our cities are very unresilient because they specialize. The funny thing is that we talked as planners for years about diversity and complexity, but in fact, if we look at the economies of cities, they are not so diverse as they could. The second mechanism of urban growth is related to scarcity. So planners have been often using plans, strategic and operational plans that defined zones of investments. We basically think in terms of, okay, where are the best places where we can get out the most outcome, and where do we need to target our efforts and investments? These places usually are, areas of nodes like airports or intersections, entire parts of regions like the south flank of Amsterdam, or the the south part of the south and north flank of Milan in relation to Switzerland and to the south of Italy, or you can take other industrial areas where basically planners are concentrating their investments. Actually, in the last 10 years, we have a lot of these project-led or development-led strategies of planning that tend to promote investments in specific areas. We do that by basically planning the city in a way that where land becomes available in certain places and is not available for development in other places. It's a way we basically organize land use that allows markets basically to navigate and to understand where is better to invest rather than not. By doing that, of course, we generate income, and with that income, we pay for services, right? For social housing and green, as I said before. The last mechanism that allows these first two to happen is what I define as a Euclidean zoning. That's probably the most long-lasting institution in planning today. And it's a bit of the brother or sister of the Cartesian thinking in economics. Maybe you read about this in recent books of Jason Hickel, Kate Raworth. The argument there is that we separate the idea of the economy on one side and the idea of nature and ecology on the other. We separate humans from nature, we make it human-centered, and then we organize our whole interaction, our own policies around that. In planning, this happens through a Euclidean zoning, which is basically the way of dividing land into land uses that are mostly defined from the point of view of human life, right? Like commercial, housing, horeca, or mobility. Our cities are divided as flat maps into land uses. This is something that planners did already since century, basically. However, is a way that is, and therefore it's very hard to change this, but it's a way that nowadays is becoming not useful for the new way we're thinking our relations with each other and with nature. Will come clearer in the second. Okay. So here there are three examples of what I just said. One you just saw it. Specialization. I could have taken a financial district, but I decided to take farming in the Netherlands. An economy that is driving this country, which is oriented to global flows, just less than 20% is for self-provision, is basically becoming extremely monocultural, monodiverse in the country. And it needs continuous inflow of subsidies and energy in order to survive. It's basically an economy that is doomed to death. We know it. We know it since 1995. The government have repeatedly ignored this. Now shit has hit the fan, is being ignored again, and it will hit the fan again in 10 years when eventually we will have to transition to a different form of economy in that sense. Land scarcity. This is a project in the east of Amsterdam where the city has decided to allow development in a very small area in order to maximize the value that is generated there through an extremely high dense neighborhood. No cars, only pedestrians and bikes, very high density. Yet, most of the planners I talk to in the city are very critical of these projects because they know that the next crisis will make a disaster out of this. Next real estate crisis. The investment volume and the densities are so high, which that if there is a real estate crisis, prices will drop, and the quality, the interest of investors will decrease dramatically. Because in fact, the amount of investment required is extremely high, and is based on high volumes, and is extremely low in terms of resilience.
Okay.
So it's a typical case where a real estate crisis would hit very hard. And this high density area development require contracts that last for years, so 10, 20 years, which also means that the city bounds itself to the continuous inflows of developers' money, which then tend to suffer in case there is a fluctuation in the market.
Okay.
This happened in 2008, clearly, in projects like this. But we forgot about that because now there is a new growth period. Like the last one is a clear case of how Euclidean zoning allow us to basically make a very suboptimal greening solution. So we have a residential space, we define it as residential, and then we are just left with the options to put trees on it in order to make it more natural. Everything is better than nothing, that's clear. But well, at one point we will have to accept the fact that we need to do more. I didn't mention the word capitalism at all until so far. And I think we can have that discussion. I will show you a few solutions. I don't think that this story is incompatible with a degree, in fact, of market exchange and a degree of private property, of course. This is not incompatible. But one thing is a financialized capitalism where basically the added value in terms of social values is minimal. One thing is an economy based on real needs of people. So we can talk about what type of economy we want. Of course, when we talk about market and liberalism, the story of degrowth is that we should ensure basic access to basic services: water, heating, housing, food. It's not acceptable and not ethical anymore, I think, in current times, to think that few people can own a lot of it and others cannot access it. So I'm also embedding my story in the current, mentality and ethic of limits. So the market education we got in the last decades was built in a time where planetary limits were not relevant, in fact. Now, the material conditions of life and economy are changed. So we need to also revise our principles, our ethics and values to make that compatible with the most important target, which is survival of our species. Because the climate science is telling us very clearly that the way we're living is not enough. So what does degrowth mean for cities? That was how I would answer to that question. No, so this is, again, all in the paper that is called Urban Degrowth. It's open access, you can find it. So from specialization to autonomy, that's the first proposal. We should start thinking in terms of cities as city regions, as spaces of self-provision. Of course, it's impossible to provide food and energy for all the people living in the city. I'm not getting there, but I think that as a planner, we should reflect on what is available there and what can we self-provide and how we can increase that. It's a target more than an absolute. This means also to try to bring back into urban and regional planning the question of energy, food, and material supplies. Where are the materials coming from? Where is the food coming from? Where is the energy coming from? Is that coming from fossil-based or not? Is it possible to generate those resources within regional spaces? Yes, no. These are the questions that planners could ask themselves. Of course, when we think about autonomy, we also think in terms of boundaries. So if we have an excessively globalized material flow, we should also think in terms of how do we reduce that? What can we cut out of the flows that we have? What are the ones that are less necessary for the well-being? This type of questions is what are related to autonomy. There are different scales at which we can think about it. When I think about autonomy, I'm not talking about one city region, but we could also imagine going back to the famous concept of bioregionalism. You're familiar with it, I hope? No, in the 70s, there was this large wave of landscape architects and planners that started to think in terms of bioregions. And the bioregion is an area, a territory that is somehow sharing particular biophysical and geological properties that, of course, relate to energy, forms of energy and food production. And these regions are also sharing some cultural, some lifestyle choices to a certain degree. They are related to they relate society and environment and ecology. And they, for example, in Europe, there are, in fact, a number of bioregions that share particular functions geologically and that could integrate much better their supply of food, energy. So we're talking about large-scale planning. And in fact, in Europe, at one point, we started thinking in terms of the Mediterranean bioregion and starting plan for, economies that would share their, the support each other within this region. But it's a different map than what we use now, right? To plan international, transnational functions. However, if we want to go at the macro scale of autonomy, then we could also look at how new forms of housing provision can be increase autonomy. This is a project that I've been contributed to. I invented it together with 10 people. It's an experiment of a housing cooperative that tries to raise as much as possible energy and reuse water within their block. It's a way of degrowth living, which is oriented to downscale, of course, the consumption, but also trying to meet needs within the plot where they are residing. This type of development is much different, of course, than the prefabricating large-scale, housing that we see today. The other challenge is to move from an idea of scarcity to one of finity. So finity is basically embracing an idea that what we need in cities is not to promote necessarily investments endlessly in some areas, but more like think in terms of minimum and maximum standards within a city. This goes also in the debates about what type of regulations and what type of institutions are needed in planning today. So if we take the whole territory of a city and we think in terms of maximum and minimum standards, we would have a very different map of investments. We will see that some areas need improvement, needs investments, especially when housing and green and healthcare are not met. And we see areas where we need, in fact, to tap and cap and reduce and take in order to redistribute. Now, there are many cases of this thing already happening. So when I say this, some people think, this is eco-socialism or things like this. Well, this is not correct. Let's try to discuss. Planners use finity rules all the time, but they are never proud of them, but they are very useful. Give me an example of a finity rule. Can you think about one? There are so many that we use as planners. They are so important, but generally we think, no, they are not ideal.
Parking permits?
Yeah, parking permits, maximum parking permits, yeah. Low traffic zones, no car access into the city center. Volumes, maximum height, so many. Tourist visits. Venice is thinking to reduce tourist visits, to regulate tourist visits. These are maximum standards, right? Maximum. You can't have more than that. There are minimum standards too. I mean, most of planners in actually a liberal form of planning use minimum standards to pay for services all the time, like parking lot again, but schools, churches, green spaces, nature, These rules are there, are available now. They are not necessarily communist rules, but as planners led to development thinking, we tend to ignore their value. So my argument that we should valorize those rule-based planning more than scarcity and investment-led planning. So basic rules, making this type of planning tools more visible would allow us to identify, in fact, where it's needed to reduce and where it's needed to increase. So if you take, if you will be a national planner, think in terms of a regional scale, let's say the Randstad or the area of Groningen, then you will start thinking in terms of where are the areas where basic human needs are not met, and of course you have to take a whole operational definition of these needs. Where are areas where there is excess? You can map the territory based on those indicators. Now, once you have that type of vision of the space, then you can start and think, okay, what type of new tools we might need in order to reduce what we think is too much. This is being done, for example, now with the nitrogen. We know what is the maximum emission of nitrogens. We know what should be allowed to protect nature and environment and humans. The point is that the enforcement of the rules, of course, it's dominated by lobbyists in the government, and I think that's a discussion we should have at one point, power games. But I think working in terms of these standards would be a different way than work in terms of, okay, what are the areas where we generate most income? I think it's a discussion that should be held at all scales of planning scales that we have available now. Again, this is not a project of nationalizing planning. It's a project of starting discussion about these factors. Yeah. When we think about living space, we should consider there are cases of underuse of space, right? And overuse of resources of that space in a situation of where we have scarcity of concrete and materials. That means that we could consider that an underuse of space will be really unethical at this stage. So will be something to tackle. When I mean underuse, I mean, for example, single household families or two-person household family living in 200 or 300 square meters in the middle of Amsterdam, where there is a 10% of 50% of all social housing families that don't have enough space. This type of reflection would allow us to modulate our taxation system based on relative use of space. Now we tax property based on one percentage of the property value, right? That's the only way we tax it. Why not instead maybe thinking about a taxation system that where the percentage increases with the decrease with the, let's say, a lower ratio of users per square meters. So in this way, a rich person owning 200 square meters in the center of Amsterdam and living in it with one person would pay more taxes, of course, than somebody having less space. This is a redistributive policy. You target wealth where it's concentrated, and especially where that wealth impacts also materially and spatially, because you take more space in a city where there is a lack of space. I think this would be a socially redistributive policy. I think it would be also compatible with environmental targets. There is economic research now that showed us the question: what can we afford in our daily life in order to meet the Paris target? Because most of the idea is that we would go back to the Stone Age, right? Well, actually, this research has showed by a team based in Switzerland that, for example, the space, the square meters would be 25 per person, 25 square meters per person. So you could be compatible with 25 square meters per person. That means that if you are a 4-person family household, you will live 100 square meters. That could be a threshold to tax then underuse. The same worked with energy. Now there was an energy crisis. The government, neoliberal government, decided to basically give money to energy providers in order to reduce energy to everybody, right? That was the strategy. Well, this is a way that we know will cost a lot of money. And it's not fair because you give the amount of money to everybody depending on how they use. The best way would have been to have a minimum use of energy, average use of energy, and excessive use of energy, and associate pricing based on that. So this type of reasoning fit the degrowth agenda, because it does disincentivize excess. Well, these are two radical examples of also other ways to think in terms of limit. I mean, in Berlin, they really voted for expropriating, owners of too many dwellings. Is an extreme way to do it. Of course, I just wanted to present. But there is also a much less extreme way to think in terms of limits. This is the noise area of Schiphol in Amsterdam. These are the zones for environmental safety, smell, and emissions of industries in the harbor of Amsterdam. This is the center of Amsterdam. These images show that planners do have that toolkit already to measure excesses. The problem here is that that nobody ever enforced the environmental permit on Schiphol. Schiphol doesn't have an environmental permit, right? Yeah. So funnily enough, we are making a great exception for this big money-making machine, while we know that 70% of the flights are exchange flights. So there's a big debate about Schiphol. I think Schiphol is a very interesting case of how we believe that airports drive growth, but actually there are numbers showing that it's much less than what we believe. The last proposal that I wish is to move from this Euclidean, human-centered way of thinking in terms of zones to a one that is more oriented to habitats and habitability. Now, I use the word habitat instead of habitability, instead of livability, deliberately, because the livability frameworks that as planners we use frequently are very much human and brain-centered. So they basically measure things that we need for our brains and our economies to work. But they hardly measure anything related to our bodies. We do not need only social contacts. We do need good bacterial environment, good air quality. We need good food, healthcare, and to prevent and preventive healthcare in order to live and survive. So, in fact, the habitat is the capacity of a particular physical space to support the activity of an organism, and that's humans also. That is to provide the set of resources and conditions required for its way of life. If we take a more than human approach to this, we will start, in fact, thinking in terms of urban spaces as regenerative spaces and spaces where biodiversity and environmental qualities needs to be increased dramatically. That's perhaps the largest challenge. How do we do that? And I think this is the largest challenge, as I said, because the zoning tools that we have are the oldest at our disposal. But I think we can start thinking in terms of relations. So we do have several, in fact, 6 natural cycles, right, in space. Probably you are more familiar with the nitrogen cycle, right, because the discussion is in the Netherlands. Yet we hardly embrace these cycles when we plan chunks of land. We hardly think in terms of, okay, how one particular land use affect that cycle that impact other areas. So my invitation would be to planners to get more acquainted with these natural cycles and start thinking in terms of planning for those cycles. So how to improve the nitrogen cycle, how to improve the phosphorus cycle, how to improve the water cycle. I don't have time here to explain you what these are. It took time to me as well to get involved with these things, but I was so happy to do it because I really learned a lot how space works, how water flows in cities, how it gets out of the city, goes somewhere else, how it's pulled, especially phosphorus, how basically biomass can be reused. This knowledge is not yet available in our planning curricula. It's not available in the planning world. We need to embrace this in order to think in terms of planetary boundaries. And this will allow us also, and here comes with the reflection we had before, comes to think in terms of key zones where, urban and natural areas are actually being connected in a regenerative way. If we do this well, we would imagine some sort of distributed natural planning that would include urban as one of the functions. Let me give you 2 examples. So this is an example. In many cases we think about urban gardens as one way to increase diversity in cities, right? There is a garden where we put plants and bees and all the things. This is a bit the classic way to do it. But why not think in terms of neighborhood as expanded productive urban fabrics? That's what a colleague of mine, Deborah, did. Is a project of thinking neighborhoods as a system, not for humans, but for biodiversity. So taking a neighborhood and thinking in terms of how that neighborhood sustain biodiversity. And there you see that the fabric that comes out is expanded. So there are different areas of nature that are connected with each other. This is a way of planning that is completely not human-centered, which allow us to think about spaces in a habitat form. The same can be done at the regional scale. So this is one example from Colombia, where this region was planned starting from the different farming productions for local provisions. So the whole region was planned around the potential of autonomous farming, not around other forms of economy. Well, what would that mean in a country like the Netherlands? It would be a deep restructuring of its land use, of course. So just to conclude, this is just a summary. Degrowth, a socio-political project of metabolic reduction, so slowing down, closing the metabolism of cities and downscaling it. It's about increasing or reflecting in terms of material and political autonomy of city regions, embracing a reflection on affinity, maximum, minimum standards. Think in terms of excess and minimum standards allows for thinking in terms of redistribution, and of course, thinking in terms of regenerative spaces related to cycles. And this, I think, maybe is the massive challenge for our planning education, but I think we can start working on it. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you, Federico. Thank you very much for taking us last 1 hour, 20 minutes into all your thoughts on
discussion.
1 hour, 20 minutes, including
That's a compliment.
I was almost about to say that, including a lot of discussions. So thanks for your questions, for your input, also for your presentations before. That was a great compliment to that, to take us into both more than human and degrowth thinking. We got a lot of potential ways forward. The potential way forward, of course, relates to all of us, and not only to us here, not only to Federico. I hope there's more than you can, who's continuing taking this up, and maybe some of those taking it up are in this room. So that's, I think, a hope of us.
There's a book I forgot. The last slide was this.
There's even another last slide.
Christian is also part of this book.
Oh, cool. So I think that's an invitation to download, to read that. It is also available through our library. And last, I'm sure you stay in touch with this topic, these discussions. Have a break now. I will also ensure that we get a bit of sunlight towards the end.